Welcome to the deep dive. If you feel like the ground is completely shifted under the tech industry recently, you're definitely not imagining it.
No, you're really not.
Today, we are looking at a stack of sources describing what is being called really the most significant government intervention into a major American tech company this century.
Yeah, we are looking at a defining moment, and it's wild because it played out over just a 48-hour period.
Just 2 days.
Right. It started with this major standoff between the artificial intelligence lab Anthropic and the Pentagon. And that standoff escalated into a full-blown crisis, which ended with rival company OpenAI swooping in to take the deal.
Exactly. So the mission for today's deep dive is to unpack this really complex supply chain standoff. We are going to explore the hidden loopholes in government contracts, analyze the mechanics of the safety stack.
Which is a huge part of this.
It really is. And look at what happens when the principles of tech builders collide with the demands of national security. And as always, we will keep it simple, clear, and in-depth.
To understand the landscape here, the conflict itself is really the best starting point.
Yeah, let's start there.
So Anthropic, they're one of the leading AI labs, right? And they drew two very specific, unmovable red lines for their artificial intelligence technology. First, they stated absolutely no mass domestic surveillance.
Okay.
And second, no fully autonomous weapons.
Right, and on the surface, that might sound like a pretty standard ethical framework for a company building powerful technology.
You'd think so, yeah.
You build a system, and you establish that you do not want it used to monitor citizens or operate weapons without human oversight. But the Pentagon's response was that those limitations were just a complete non-starter for their procurement needs.
Right. And when Anthropic refused to budge on those two red lines, the Pentagon deployed a remarkably aggressive tactic. I mean, they threatened to label the startup a supply chain risk.
And we really need to pause on that because that threat carries an immense amount of weight. To understand why, you really have to look at how the government usually applies that label. Because the term supply chain risk, it's not just a bureaucratic slap on the wrist.
Oh, not at all. It is a designation that is usually reserved for foreign adversaries. Or, suspicious telecommunications gear manufactured by overseas rivals.
Right, like companies that are actively blocked from American infrastructure due to espionage concerns.
Yes. It is almost never used against a domestic American startup. If that label gets applied, it essentially orders the entire United States military and often the broader federal government to cut all ties with the company.
So no contracts?
No contracts, no software usage, no integration. It is essentially a commercial quarantine in the defense sector.
And the ripple effects of that go far beyond just losing a single defense contract.
Oh, absolutely.
If the Pentagon flags a foundational AI model as a supply chain risk, it puts immense pressure on the cloud providers hosting that model.
Right, because you have companies like Amazon Web Services or Google Cloud.
Exactly. Companies which have massive federal contracts of their own, they suddenly have to navigate whether hosting Anthropic jeopardizes their own compliance.
The isolation would just be absolute. I mean, you have an American AI company facing the exact same punitive measures used for foreign intelligence threats simply because they maintained a boundary on domestic surveillance and autonomous weapons.
But the Pentagon did eventually put a compromise on the table, right?
They did. They offered a deal allowing the military to use the AI models for what they termed all lawful uses.
All lawful uses. Now, if you are listening to this, you might wonder where the friction is there. We have legal frameworks in place, so authorizing a technology for lawful use seems entirely standard.
It does sound standard, but the friction comes from a really significant structural gap in American law.
Okay, break that down for us.
Well, the United States lacks a comprehensive national privacy law. Because there is no overarching federal framework protecting citizen data from commercial exploitation, the word lawful is forced to do a lot of heavy lifting.
It creates a vast operational gray area.
Exactly. Let's look at the mechanics of how this works in practice based on the examples in our sources.
Right.
Consider the data broker industry. It is perfectly legal for government agencies to purchase massive aggregated data sets of consumer information from private data brokers.
Because the data is purchased on the open commercial market.
Right. And because of that, it is not legally classified under the strict definitions of government surveillance.
So the legal classification is one thing, but the functional reality is completely different.
Completely. Through these commercial purchases, government agencies can acquire location data, purchasing habits, and online behavioral patterns without ever navigating the traditional warrant process.
Wow.
And if an AI company agrees to the all lawful uses clause, their language model can be legally integrated into that exact pipeline.
And this is where the technical integration changes the game entirely. Because we are not just talking about a human analyst reading through a purchase spreadsheet.
No, not at all.
Imagine taking an incredibly powerful large language model and connecting it via API to those massive data broker data sets.
Right, alongside things like public social media feeds.
The AI model basically becomes a frictionless, real-time processing engine.
Yes. And our sources point out, we have already seen instances where agencies cross-reference immigration applications against social media activity.
Which is already a huge task.
Exactly. But when you introduce an advanced LLM into that workflow, it can autonomously correlate disparate data points, summarize behavioral patterns, and flag anomalies across millions of records in seconds.
It transforms raw, legally purchased data into a highly targeted, automated dragnet.
That's exactly the analogy the sources use, a dragnet. And Anthropic looked at that specific integration pipeline and held their ground.
They realized that agreeing to the lawful use standard meant their technology could be deployed to scan and profile at a massive scale.
Right. It would all happen entirely within the bounds of the law, but it would fundamentally violate their internal red line against facilitating mass domestic surveillance.
So they made a definitive choice to prioritize the spirit of their principles over the legal wording of the contract.
They did. And as a result, they faced that severe isolation and the looming threat of the supply chain risk label.
But then the entire dynamic shifted.
Literally within hours.
Yeah, within hours of Anthropic's standoff reaching its peak, OpenAI CEO Sam Altman announced that they had successfully reached a deal with the Pentagon.
And the announcement came with a fascinating caveat. OpenAI publicly claimed that they were maintaining the exact same red lines that Anthropic had just defended.
Right, they stated they also opposed their models being used for mass domestic surveillance or autonomous weapons.
The juxtaposition there is just striking. You have Anthropic facing severe penalties for holding a boundary.
And then OpenAI secures the contract while claiming to hold the exact same boundary.
And the Pentagon accepts the terms.
It forces an analysis of how OpenAI squared that circle.
Yeah.
I mean, how do you satisfy the Pentagon's procurement requirements while claiming to protect the red lines that just tanked the previous negotiation?
Well, OpenAI's defense relies on an architectural concept they refer to as the safety stack.
The safety stack.
Right. They argue that their protections are not just policy promises written on a piece of paper, but technical guardrails integrated directly into the model's core architecture and training loop.
So it's baked into the system itself.
Exactly. Their argument is that through reinforcement learning from human feedback and system-level prompts, the safety stack restricts the model's outputs regardless of what the user asks it to do.
So they claim the model is technically constrained from executing tasks that violate their safety policies.
Like acting as a surveillance tool.
Yes. But the sources present a very sharp counter perspective to the efficacy of this safety stack. And we need to look at this impartially.
We do. Critics of this approach argue that relying on technical guardrails for a complex policy issue is essentially security theater.
Security theater, meaning it provides the illusion of safety without addressing the underlying mechanics of how the technology is actually deployed.
Right, because the skepticism is rooted in what a large language model fundamentally is.
Yeah.
At its core, an LLM is a statistical engine.
It's designed to predict the next token in a sequence based on its training data and the context provided to it.
Exactly. It does not possess a conscience. And it certainly cannot parse the legal provenance of the data injected into its context window.
So if an agency legally purchases a massive data set of location pings and behavioral data,
Which we know they do.
right, and feeds that raw text into the OpenAI model via an enterprise API, the model has absolutely no way of knowing the origin of that data.
None. It doesn't know if the data was gathered through a commercial broker or a targeted wiretap.
That is a major structural flaw that critics point out. The AI cannot inherently know that the data it is processing was gathered in a way that functions as a surveillance dragnet.
Exactly. If an authorized user prompts the system to sort and cross-reference these behavioral profiles, the model will execute the command.
Because it's just processing data.
Right. A technical guardrail integrated during the training phase cannot override the reality of what the model is asked to process in a deployed enterprise environment.
So if the safety stack is viewed by critics as highly permeable in these specific use cases, How did OpenAI successfully navigate the Pentagon's requirements where Anthropic failed?
Well, the sources point toward a broader strategic maneuver known as regulatory capture.
Regulatory capture. Let's define that for a second.
Sure. Regulatory capture occurs when a dominant company in an industry becomes so closely intertwined with the governing bodies regulating it that the company effectively shapes the rules to its own advantage.
And the analysis in our sources suggests OpenAI has mastered the political and bureaucratic game far better than its competitors.
It's really about defining the threshold of compliance. OpenAI utilized sophisticated legal and technical frameworks to give the Pentagon exactly what it required on paper,
Right, they offered the safety stack as the definitive solution.
which allowed the Pentagon to check the necessary compliance boxes while OpenAI publicly maintained their moral high ground.
Meanwhile, Anthropic stood firmly on the philosophical spirit of their principles. They refused to play the legal word games, and they were penalized for it.
Exactly. OpenAI, conversely, provided a technical framework that satisfied the bureaucracy.
And the deeper implication of regulatory capture here is pretty massive. It means that OpenAI's specific safety stack might become the de facto procurement standard for the entire defense sector.
Yes. If the Pentagon accepts OpenAI's architecture as the gold standard for safe AI deployment, any other company that refuses to adopt that exact framework.
Or refuses to accept the all lawful uses loophole.
Right. They are effectively locked out of the defense market.
It is a brilliant, albeit controversial, method of solidifying market dominance through government compliance.
And it highlights a stark divide in Silicon Valley's current operational philosophy. You have factions attempting to act as the ethical conscience of the industry, and you have factions mastering institutional maneuvering.
Which brings us to a historical comparison in the sources that I found fascinating. It provides critical context for why these companies view these negotiations as existential.
Yes, the background detail regarding Anthropic's CEO, Dario Amodei.
Right. He has harbored a long-standing obsession with the history of the Manhattan Project.
He has communicated to his teams for years that the artificial intelligence models they're building will eventually carry the same geopolitical and societal consequences as the invention of nuclear weapons.
And connecting the current standoff to the Manhattan Project fundamentally shifts the framework of this entire conversation.
It really does. For you listening, it serves as a stark reality check regarding where this technology is heading.
Because the public perception of AI has largely been shaped by the consumer internet era. Chatbots writing emails, generating code, or creating funny images.
Right. But the intensity of this 48-hour negotiation proves that foundational AI models are no longer viewed merely as consumer products.
They are now classified as dual-use technologies. They are strategic national assets.
The transition from a consumer novelty to a core pillar of national security architecture is happening right now.
And that transition is causing massive ripple effects across the tech ecosystem. The broader industry context in our sources shows a clear strategic realignment.
Tech leaders and venture capital firms are pivoting aggressively toward defense technology.
There is a very noticeable shift toward aligning with the defense establishment. And it's driven by the realization that the largest pools of capital and influence in the coming decade will flow through government contracts.
The new reality for Silicon Valley is coming into focus. If a company wants to operate at the absolute highest level of the global market, building trillion-dollar infrastructure, they must be in lockstep with the state.
The era of the tech industry being openly adversarial to the U.S. military.
Which we saw a decade ago with various employee protests over defense contracts.
Right, that era seems to be closing.
The sheer scale of the capital required to train the next generation of AI models, we're talking tens of billions of dollars for compute and energy. It means these companies cannot afford to be shut out of the federal market.
You cannot scale a frontier AI lab if the government slaps a supply chain risk label on your core product.
Exactly. Which makes Anthropic's attempt to draw a hard line in the sand regarding surveillance even more notable.
They attempted to impose their internal ethical framework onto a sovereign government's national security apparatus. And they encountered the full force of the state's procurement leverage.
The situation reveals a really complex and often contradictory dynamic between the government, the tech builders, and the general public.
Because the government is moving with immense speed, demanding unfettered access to these capabilities to maintain geopolitical superiority.
But the public's expectations of privacy and corporate responsibility often diverge sharply from those military imperatives.
And the sources mention a very specific anecdote that captures this disconnect perfectly.
The Katy Perry post.
Yes. Pop star Katy Perry publicly posted about shifting her AI usage to Anthropic's Claude model.
Specifically praising their ethical stance.
Right. It is a surreal moment. You have massive cultural figures and everyday consumers publicly aligning with the company that actively resisted the Pentagon's surveillance parameters.
It perfectly illustrates the dual reality these companies operate within. The consumer market heavily values privacy, transparency, and ethical boundaries.
A company can build immense brand loyalty by championing those values.
However, the capital markets and the defense sector value capability, integration, and compliance with national security objectives.
And when those two worlds inevitably collide, the government possesses the ultimate leverage.
They hold the cards.
They do. So why does the mechanics of a single defense contract matter to you? Because this standoff is merely the opening sequence.
The friction between the engineers who build the foundational architecture of the future and the institutions tasked with governing it is only going to intensify rapidly.
The immediate metric to watch is whether the unredacted text of these government contracts ever surfaces publicly.
Right, because currently the technical definitions of lawful use and the specific auditing mechanisms of the safety stack are locked behind closed doors.
The true nature of the agreement will only be known if those documents see the light of day.
We will then see the actual legal language dictating how the data flows.
We will see if the safety stack operates as a robust, verifiable physical wall against mass surveillance.
Or if it functions merely as a paper screen, a compliance checklist that allows the deployment to proceed unchallenged.
And the outcome of that will set the precedent for how all future dual-use technologies are integrated into state infrastructure.
It really will.
We want to leave you with a final thought to mull over long after this deep dive ends.
Something to really think about.
Consider the historical weight of the Manhattan Project comparison we talked about. If foundational artificial intelligence models are truly evolving into the defining strategic assets of this century,
Can any single private tech company realistically maintain a moral red line against a sovereign government?
or is the nature of this technology simply too powerful and too deeply intertwined with national survival to ever truly remain subject to the ethical whims of a private boardroom?
The resolution to that tension will map the trajectory of both technology and civil liberties for the next generation.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We will be watching the fallout of this standoff closely.
And we hope you will too.